Okay, thank you, Father Bill. And uh, since we don't have further questions, I would like to ask Father Bill to go ahead and continue the presentation.
Okay, so in this second part, I'd like to look at three things. First, what St. Ignatius says in general about spiritual exercises, and I'd like to relate that to the itineraries. Second, I'd like to look at the structure and dynamic of a typical exercise in Itinerary 1. And third, I'd like to look at the three ways of praying. Those actually appear in the last part of Itinerary 2. But some guides and facilitators use them as a kind of bridge from Itinerary 1 into Itinerary 2. So I'd like to talk about that, about those three ways as well. So what are spiritual exercises anyway? This is the very first paragraph in the spiritual exercises. By the term spiritual exercises, we mean every method of examination of conscience, meditation, contemplation, vocal or mental prayer, or other spiritual activities, such as will be mentioned later. And he says, they're any means of preparing and disposing our soul to rid itself of disordered affections, and then after their removal, of seeking and finding God's will in the ordering of our life for the salvation of our soul. So notice that spiritual exercises include things I do in formal times of prayer: examination of conscience, meditation, contemplation, vocal or mental prayer. Also, any means of preparing and disposing our soul. So these might include things that I do outside of the time of prayer, like looking or listening or walking. Any way that helps me to notice what's blocking me. What's blocking me from experiencing God in creation might be I don't look. I don't look at things. I don't really look. So exercises include things I do in prayer and outside of the time of prayer. So Itinerary 2, in prayer. Itinerary 1, primarily outside prayer. And these spiritual exercises are graduated. He says, just as taking a walk, traveling on foot, and running are physical exercises, spiritual exercises are the same. Those three physical exercises, taking a walk, traveling on foot, you might say in today's language, hiking or running, are progressively more demanding. When one begins to exercise, he or she doesn't begin with running or hiking, but with walking. And then little by little, they build up. In time, he or she builds up to activity requiring more exertion. To do otherwise in physical exercise is to risk an injury. But to do otherwise in spiritual exercises is to risk frustration, discouragement, and abandoning of prayer. It's too heavy, it's too much, I can't do it, and so I give up. So one of the great gifts of the itineraries is that their design respects this gradual way of training. I start small and I build up. So I start with something I can have success at. Because if I start by trying to pray 1 hour every day, within 4 days, I'm going to stop. Because I'll miss one day and I'll think I'm no good at it. But if it's 15 minutes or 10 minutes, it's something I might have some success at. So don't be filled by what building up means. A more developed method a method with more steps doesn't necessarily mean better prayer. The best method is the method that helps one most to dispose oneself to God's presence and action in the time of prayer. So the best method is the one that helps. Remember Thomas Keating's remark, we need a method to hang in there. What's the method for? It's to help me stay in relationship with God. And when there's a disruption in the relationship, when I draw back in fear, or when a hurting place in my heart gets touched, then and I react, that might be the time that the method is very helpful to me. For some people, the best method might be the simplest one. It might have no more than 1 or 2 steps. So I'd like to look briefly, we saw this last time with Father Julian, at the structure of an exercise in Itinerary 1. Each suggested exercise includes 3 moments in the morning, a dedicated time of formal prayer of 10 or 15 minutes, or perhaps more. During the day, returning at intervals, either to the experience of prayer or to the specific practice that's suggested, to allow the prayer to permeate one's day. And then, in the evening, looking back at the experience of the day, recalling its moments and gathering up its fruits. So I'd like to say something also about the dynamics, how the 3 parts work together of an exercise like this. The typical exercise in Itinerary 1 brings 2 realities into contact. A basic experience of everyday human life. In a minute, this is the during the day part. In a minute, we'll look at an example. We'll look at the example of using my sight, using my vision, looking. A basic experience of everyday human life, and a human experience captured in 1 or more texts of Scripture. How Jesus gazes, how Jesus looks, how the person of faith looks to God for help. So it's important to recognize that everything that's recorded in Scripture was a human experience first, and human nature hasn't changed that much. So here too, I go back to what Liam shared last time. The experience of Scripture, what's recorded there, and my own experience, they illuminate one another, each providing insight into the other. And in the process, the truth of both becomes more personal. So let's look at the example now, praying with sight. I'm going to lift just a few quotes out of the exercise. In the morning and throughout the day, take note of how you use your eyes, your glance, the exercise says. Then, as time passes, take note of how you see, how you look at things, what you look at. Along with looks of compassion, you might be surprised by others, of contempt or control or apathy. Scripture might also help. As an example, the exercise suggests, you can refer to Psalm 123 and see how the afflicted pray. You might also learn from Jesus in some of the scenes in which are highlighted precisely his way of looking. So it's in the morning and throughout the day. And then in the evening, recall how your glances left you. Are you at peace and content? Do certain things or people come to mind? Do you notice, really notice what you look at? Does your way of looking leave you tranquil or instead restless and worried? and see if you've allowed yourself to be surprised by the glances of Jesus. Now, I've just lifted out a few quotes, but for some of us, this may be many words. So as an example, I'd like to show you, here's one way that the method could be simplified. Look, pay attention. Consider how the person of faith looks. And then at the end of the day, ask, how did looking affect you? Notice that the exercise is the same. For some, the additional words are helpful. But for some, they might get tripped up or they might get confused. The exercise is quite simple. Look. Consider how people of faith look. Notice how looking has affected your heart. And as a way of adapting the method, when I look at this exercise, I might make a very simple adaptation. In the morning, in my dedicated time of prayer, consider how the person of faith looks. Then throughout the day, I look, I pay attention. And I might have a little seed of my morning prayer that helps me to appreciate the similarity or difference between the way I look and the way I saw Jesus look. And then at the end of the day, I ask, how did looking affect me? So praying with sight is an example of what may be the simplest method in the spiritual exercises. The method really has two moments. Pay attention, notice, and let what you attend to, what you fix your attention on, let it affect you. Then remember, ponder. How were you affected? Wonder about it. Be curious. In fact, all of Ignatian's spirituality might well be described as a spirituality of noticing and wondering. So I'd like to say something about the three methods of praying, and I hope this will help to shine some light on how formal praying can become personal. So the first method, praying with sight, is part of what Ignatius calls the three methods of praying. It's part of the first method. He intends these for anyone who wants to get some instruction and to reach a certain peace of soul. So anybody at all. The first method includes prayer on the 10 Commandments, prayer on the capital sins, prayer on the 3 powers of the soul, and prayer on the 5 senses of the body. And at least the first 3 can sound very abstract. The first 2 sound like things that I would learn in religious education when I'm about 7 or 8 years old. They can seem very impersonal, but this is not at all what Ignatius intends. He intends me to use these ways of praying in a very personal way. So if I choose to pray with the 10 Commandments, in what, I ask myself, in what do I keep the commandments? How do I violate them? So I can stay on what's personally important to me, reflecting on when I act with virtue and when I struggle to act with virtue. Prayer on the capital sins, similar. What is the sin that I struggle with? And he says, you don't have to spend much time on what you don't struggle with or what doesn't bring encouragement to you. So if there's a virtue that I'm perfecting, I might want to pay attention to that. If there's a virtue I'm struggling with, I might want to pay attention to that. But the things that aren't important to me in my life right now, I don't need to give them any attention at all. Similarly, how do I use the powers of my soul? What do I go back to when I remember the past? Do I go back to hurts? Do I go back to joys? How do I use my intellect? What do I think about? And how do I use my will? What criteria do I use to choose? What blocks me from choosing in the way I hope to? And similarly on the five senses, how am I using my sight, my listening, my touch? Now, the second method is a method of praying with a formal prayer. First, one chooses a posture that will help him or her to pray, help them to be at peace, then focuses his or her attention through his or her gaze. So for some of us, that means closing our eyes. But for me, when I close my eyes, my distractions increase. So that's not a good thing for me to do. It doesn't help me to focus. So I fix my eyes on a certain point or an object, maybe a holy image, and I don't let my gaze move from that. So that's how I stay focused. So of the formal way of prayer, the formal prayer I've chosen, I say the first word, Father, if I'm praying with the Our Father, and I consider it, as long as meanings or comparisons, consolations connected with it are found. So what might come up? My own experiences of Father, my father, seeing other fathers. Or if I'm a father, my own experience of being father. So my personal life is informing this formal prayer. And I can stay with that as long as I want. And then when it feels like it's time, I move to the second. And then to each successive word. This instruction is very important. One should not be anxious to move forward, even if the whole hour is consumed on what is being found. At the end of the hour, I can say the rest of the prayer. So notice this is connected with what Ignatius says about, what fills and satisfies the soul. It's not a lot of things. It's just a couple that are deeply pondered, known by heart, known in my heart. So prayer is not an assignment. I don't have to finish it and I'm not getting a grade on it. So remember Thomas Keating's remark on formal prayer. The second way of praying is a way that it can become more personal. The third method. Here one prays in rhythm with his or her breath, saying a word of the Our Father or any other recited prayer, with each breath taken in or expelled. In between these breaths, one reflects especially on the meaning of that word, or on the person to whom the prayer is being recited, or on one's own lowliness, or on the distance between that person's dignity and our lack of it. So I don't know how these suggestions strike you, but I kind of draw back from them for a very simple reason. The comparisons can be shaming to me. My lowliness, my lack of dignity. So for people who react like I do, here's another way of using the third way of praying. One might also consider his or her desire to grow toward that person's dignity or holiness. So it's clear that I'm not there. It's clear that I haven't become a saint yet. But Ignatius isn't nearly as concerned with perfection as he is with movement and growth. So what about my desire to move toward that? What about the invitation of God toward imitation of the virtue of the saints or of Jesus? Notice that the three methods help us to slow down. We need time to pray well. We need time to let our prayer become personal. We don't have to rush, and we don't have to finish our prayer. So again, I've said a lot in a short time, and it's good to take a break. It's good to have a chance to reflect together. So I'd like to invite us back into our triads, again to reflect, pondering what I've heard. What's captured my attention or stirred my heart? How am I feeling as I imagine working as a guide or facilitator? What questions do I have? I'd suggest we take about 15 minutes to share in triads and then come back to the main group.